go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Lauren Summers. I'm Senior Director of Lifelong Learning and Travel at the Yale Alumni Association, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this Yale Alumni Academy program. Our guest today is Professor Bracken, and I'm happy to introduce him. I think we've got enough of us here now that we can go on ahead and I can tell you a little bit about Professor Bracken for those of you who don't know him. He is Professor of Management and Political Science at Yale University. He is a respected thought leader in global competition and strategic application of technology in business and defense. His research and teaching focus on solutions for senior management as it deals with a changing strategic environment and conditions of intense uncertainty. He is a leading teacher in executive education and has run many programs for companies in finance, technology, retail, and healthcare. He is also a frequent lecturer at One Day University on topics such as problem framing in business, the future of the corporation, big business and democracy, and the second nuclear age. This past spring, he testified before the United States Senate Armed Services Committee on China's military program, and now he's here with us at Yale Alumni Academy to talk about big business, China, and the United States. Welcome, Professor Bracken.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Let me first give a warm welcome to everyone in the group. This is very gratifying to see so many old friends here and some new friends here, and it's really fun. I've always enjoyed working with alumni. It's really one of the great parts of Yale. And the alumni do such interesting things compared to most universities, it seems to me. And so it's really, I think we'll have an interesting session today because we have a curious audience, and I have, I think, some ideas which are still in the formulation stage, but often that's times when they're the kind of most interesting. Let me just give you a little bit of background about why I'm interested in this subject and what the subject is. The subject is the role of big business in US-China relations and in global politics. And I hope you can see the slide now. Okay.
You can see it.
All right. And I got interested in this because, as many of you know, I have this joint appointment in SOM and political science. And what astonished me when I got to Yale and like through decades is the lack of conversation between the two departments. And then like my career took this path where I worked at a think tank and in management consulting and did a lateral entry into academia. And when I did that, it like reinforced how much Washington, D.C. really didn't do a lot of business thinking and didn't appreciate business for its power and influence. Then historically, I was always fascinated by the role of like religion in wars and international affairs. And that's sort of dying out now in the United States, like the role of Christianity in the country and how it influences foreign policy. And people thought that what was going to replace it was the rise of NGOs and specialized academic groups like climate scientists working on climate change issues. And it strikes me that that's sort of not what happened. But what has happened is that large corporations, particularly multinational corporations, first from the United States, then from Europe, and most recently from China, are really the drivers in much of what goes on in the world economy, which influences domestic politics in the countries and influences national foreign policies. Okay, so that's kind of the origins for this. It's a sprawling subject, and one of the reasons for being a professor is to see if I can bring some order to it, so that we could at least have a coherent argument or discussion about it. since it is so complex, let me give you sort of the big points right up front, that this could be a conclusion slide at the end. But one of my big points is that the power of big business is growing enormously. In my view, it's reaching an all-time high over the past, you could say the past 200 years. 100 years wouldn't matter that much. And that the existence of this institution called business subverts and undermines classic approaches to geopolitics. I'll make it clear what that is. And so, look, if I want to caricature this a little bit, I would say, when I go to Washington, I see like people going into offices in the State Department, and they're doing things with respect to U.S.-China relations, U.S.-European relations. And a lot of this has to do with diplomatic issues. But below the surface and in the larger world, it's business that it's determining the relations between the different countries more than it is professional diplomats. It's one way to think about it. So that's like, and we really need better ways to incorporate business into foreign policy. And I'll give examples of why we need to do that. Second big point is that if we don't understand where business fits into our international policies, this has huge domestic national implications for everybody in the United States and in China. I'm going to give an example of that immediately after I get done here. And that one way to think about, so what does a framework look like for that? What it looks like is two extremes I can propose for what's going on in the world and where it could go. Let's keep this for the US and China. It could be the case that over the next 5 years, government overwhelms business. All right, that is, the power of government so taxes and regulates business that it crushes the innovative power of business to supply jobs and to supply a rising per capita GDP in countries. All right, extreme of that, this example of this, a really extreme example, would be North Korea, the Soviet Union. Okay, Venezuela might be another example. Let's go to the other extreme of this linear spectrum. Okay, and there's where business takes over, and business becomes so powerful that there's widespread abuses of business monopoly power. Companies do very, very well. They set the rules for the country, but the average person doesn't do very well. Okay, so we have these two endpoints: either government crushes business, or business. I'm going to use colorful language here just to convey the idea. It sort of hijacks government. Economists call this regulatory capture, among other things. And different people in the audience here will have a sense of where the United States is on this spectrum. Okay, but I find it's a very useful framework to debate where we might go into the future. Okay, an example of this idea that where you are in this spectrum has a powerful impact on the national domestic politics of a country. The theory of victory in the United States after World War II was that the labor unions, which represented at their peak probably 30 to 35% of the US workforce. Let's go back to the 1950s and the early 1960s. And the unions would pioneer innovations that would gradually over time transfer to everybody in the society. And what are examples of that? Well, you know what these are. The unions were demanding a 5-day work week. They were demanding paid vacation time, paid sick leave. They demanded pensions. This whole World War II now, you can't read an article in the Wall Street Journal without getting into retirement planning and pensions. I mean, before World War II, there were no pensions, and it was unions demanding these things. This little lady here and the man in the background, they're GM workers. In the early 1960s, they would have been able to own 2 cars, send their kids to college, and maybe own a small vacation house, very Spartan, up on Lake Superior. It was an incredibly successful middle class lifestyle, which was expanding. All right. The theory of victory in the United States, in my opinion, and it didn't happen, was that this thrust giving unions more power would filter to other parts of the society, and everybody would get free health, get covered health care, would get a covered pension plan. All right. As we know, that did not happen. What did happen was that US, European multinationals shifted their sourcing overseas, and instead of making the automobiles in Detroit, they made them in Japan, they made them in Brazil and Mexico, and it allowed whole sectors of the economy, like retail, to go through tremendous innovation. We wouldn't have Walmarts if we didn't have multinational corporations sourcing inexpensive products and services over in China. It was China, now Southeast Asia, and a lot of other places. Okay, the failure to recognize this, that what was happening was a hollowing out of the middle class, produced something, and I'm going to later, why this is interesting, is it's not just an American story, it's happening in China now too, with like a 30 to 40 years behind us, it's happening right now, is it produced a resentment among the average person. And there's something called populism, is defined here as an ideology, and it poses the will of the common people against the conspiring elite. Now, I'm sure you've heard this, and this is you can't sort of be an alert human being and not realize there's been a rise of populism in the United States in the last several years, influencing our presidential elections. But the failure to recognize that the hollowing out of the middle class was taking place, that was causing populism, that was causing Democrats who voted for the New Deal and FDR and Harry Truman to vote for Ronald Reagan and later for Donald Trump. Has all I'm saying, I'm not defending it, attacking it, just saying it has huge political implications, obviously. And I'm going to argue in this talk that the same thing is happening today in China. And this shows us some of the necessary distinctions and complexities that we have to identify and realize if we're going to have anything like a coherent discussion about what your corporate strategy should be for Asia or what the national strategy should be for the United States. Okay, let's go to China. And very quickly, I don't want to spend a lot of time on history. I make a very basic distinction between a superstate and a superpower. Superstate is an economic, financial, technical giant, but it keeps a low profile in international affairs. That was China from 1990s to the mid 2010s, in my view. That was certainly the view of China in the United States. Okay, superpower is that what happens if you take a super state, this big, giant, sprawling technology financial giant, okay, and give it, and it builds up military power. And something else, it uses the power it has in markets, in finance and technology to get its way in international political affairs. So today we have a super state in Japan, not a superpower. Japan doesn't have the military. What happens in the United States is that in around 2016, 2015, it depends on which institutions, there's a growing recognition that China is a superpower and that it's using its political heft, so to speak, to do all kinds of things listed on this chart, which the United States doesn't like. We don't need to really go through these things, but the artificial islands in the South China Sea, they're militarized. They're searching for US submarines. Well, if China was going to be like Japan, a sort of passive member of the international system, it would not be doing those things. And my view is that the United States had a branch point around 2015, 2016. After 2016, we really looked at China in a fundamentally different way. from the problem of integrating China into the world economy and supplying US markets to a much more strategic problem with military dimensions, but now also with strategic economic dimensions. And that's kind of where we are. Okay. Now, if we looked at this from classical geopolitics, and there's three representative writers here, these are sort of the big three of classic geopolitics: Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, and Henry Kissinger. All right. You would say, well, let's use their frameworks. We'll read them and we'll decide how we should think about the rise of China, okay? Becoming now a superpower from being a super state. And it's my contention that you really don't capture the complexities by doing this. Nonetheless, if you look at who in Washington, I mean, we have the State Department, Pentagon, CIA, and they look at the world in these terms, but they're missing like tremendous amounts. And every day we see how much more they're missing. What would you do if you were, Clausewitz would tend to militarize the problem, build up a strong military force so that China cannot use its military power. Okay. And believe me, this is going on now. What would Henry Kissinger say if he was here? Henry would say, you can't negotiate from weakness. You have to build up a broader collection of set of American power, and then get into negotiations as an equal with China, an equal in the sense of we could really hurt them economically as well as diplomatically. That would be Kissinger's recommendation, or the type of recommendation that would come out of it. And let me just give an example of that. Right now, the United States is leading something called the Quad. I don't know if people have heard of this. If you haven't heard of the Quad, you're not missing a whole lot. But basically, it's 4 countries. It's the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, which have gotten together and to hold, quote, discussions. And what the Russian foreign minister on this slide is indicating that China has been complaining about this. It's really an anti-China coalition, a diplomatic coalition meant to, I don't know, contain China is the right word, because that's loaded from Cold War days, but to prevent China from doing certain things. So in this part of the Quad movement, we have gotten India to give up its investment in 5G technology from the Huawei Corporation, the big Chinese 5G company, okay? But I would be here today to say, I'm not sure how far they can go. It's limited to diplomatic responses. I don't think it's going to change China's behavior very much. What are some other approaches? So I am arguing that these classic geopolitical frameworks are not nearly as useful as they were when Clausewitz wrote about them and when Kissinger wrote about them, where they were very useful in things like the Cold War, okay? So what's another way to look at this? Another way to look at this is to introduce business. That's the capital B here. The capital B represents the large corporations. I can define this rigorously. G is large government. Okay. Now, there's an interesting thing about big business and government in the world today, and that is every country in the world that you can think of comes out of a world historically that's on the left side of the chart, which is to say big government arose first and then big business. So, for example, in China's case, you had let's just give the more recent history post-war. You had China building the communist Mao Zedong government, and there was no business. It would be like a little dot in the Maoist era. Private enterprise was forbidden. Okay, so now when you've heard of names like Didi, the Tencent, Alibaba, all these companies' names you're beginning to hear of, this is like an incredibly new thing for China. All right. all of these companies grew up in the shadow of the Communist Party, the large, powerful government. There's one country in the world that's it's an exception. It's the one country in the world where big business rose first and big government grew in response to the excesses of big business. And that country is the United States. Okay. The reason we have a big federal government in Washington wasn't because of war or a takeover of a country. It was to respond to the railroads monopolizing freight rates in the late 19th century. It was a response to selling poisoned meats in cans, and thus we create the Food and Drug Administration to test these things. And if you look at Washington, D.C. today, my foreign students find this a very interesting chart. Let me because you've all been to Washington probably, and if you drive around, top picture is coming over 14th Street Bridge, coming onto Constitution Avenue. And if you said to Washington, if we were to go back to say 1935 through 1965, and you said, where is power in Washington? Everybody would say, well, look at Constitution Avenue. In fact, look at those buildings with their very impressive Greek columns. They're meant to convey a little bit of intimidation, but also a signal to the average person in the United States that the government is powerful and will stand up to business. If you were to go to Washington, D.C. anytime over the last 25, 30 years, you get a very different story, which is that this is Constitution Avenue. Oh, that's where the bureaucrats work, but they don't really have much power anymore. Where the power is the lobbyists, law firms, and think tanks on K Street, okay? So there's a tension I want to create between these two geolocations. I mean, this is micro geopolitics. Because what's been happening in the United States is a seesaw back and forth between big government being in charge, think Roosevelt, okay? And then with the Reagan administration and onward, a kind of shrinkage of government and outsourcing of government and policy to the think tanks, lobbyists, and law firms on K Street. Same thing is happening in China. If you look at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times over the last few days, you'll see stories about the Chinese government cracking down on Bitcoin, all right? And also cracking down on a company called Didi, that is actually a D there, that on the right-hand side. And why are they doing that? They're doing that because they think big business in China is getting too powerful, and they need to show them who's boss. So it turns out Didi just put out a offering an IPO on the New York Stock Exchange a few days ago, and the government in Beijing announced that they were going to pull their application from cell phones in China. Didi is the biggest Uber, Lyft ride-sharing company in China. It dominates the market by far. And the government in China said that if we allow them to list their stock in the New York Stock Exchange, we're going to lose control over them. We can't assure that the American CIA will not get into the databases and they can track where people in China go with their Uber rides, their Didi rides, and where people in the United States go. Okay, very similar to all of the arguments you've heard about Facebook, Google, and Apple. Exactly the same thing is happening in China. Bitcoin is similar in that it's a threat to the Chinese control over the renminbi, which is their currency. And they see private actors subverting this. And they don't like it's sort of dawning on them. So a couple of things to take away from this. First of all, China is not a monolithic actor. Anybody who tells you that it's a Marxist society, government tells business what to do. Well, in this case, government is reacting to the independent power of business two examples here, Bitcoin and a ride-sharing company, Diddy. All right. What I'd like you to think of is the reaction of the US government when big business rose in the early 20th century, that they thought they were abusing their power. So it's a very interesting parallel historical process with about 80 to 90 years separation. Okay, let me carry this a little bit forward, this analogy between big business and government, where it's going. This is a pictograph, I guess you'd call it, of the Marshall Plan, the massive US aid to Europe, which was on its back after World War II in 1947. George Marshall was the pioneer of the plan, and he gave it in a speech at Harvard University. The nice looking, charming fellow on the left is the United States, and this is the avuncular American farmer led by the United States government, who's saying, look at all those poor people in Europe. They had a war that wasn't their fault. It was Hitler. They're on their backs. We are going to give them investment aid and financial aid so that they can come back. And that's in our interest so that we can sell things and have good trade with Europe. And by the way, it's going to help us defeat communism in Europe too. Okay. And you may have heard of something called, the Marshall Plan. What is not in this pictograph here is that this is 1947. By the 1950s, one of the things that the Marshall Plan leads to is American big business going over to Europe to assist and take advantage of the prosperity that came from the Marshall Plan investment. So IBM goes over to Paris. Coca-Cola goes throughout all of Western Europe. Kodak is a major brand name, does the same thing for cameras. Okay. And the one I think is one of the most interesting in the lower left, you see the Athens Hilton, still there today. It was a few years ago, it was there. Right in Athens. And look at this, the modernistic architecture. Not only did American big business follow the investments of the Marshall Plan to reap the benefits of markets that were coming back to normalcy and growing, but they wanted to send a symbol of that America was sort of the new wave of the future. The Athens Hilton was designed by the Hilton Corporation in conjunction with the CIA to make it clear that if you wanted to embrace the future, the inevitable future, it was neoliberal capitalism as defined by the United States. It wasn't communism. And they actually had Alan Dulles working with Conrad Hilton to create a spectacular effect. You've seen so many buildings that look like this in your lifetime, it's sort of ho-hum. But if you were in Athens in the late 1950s and you saw this, you would be blown away. This was capturing the image of the future. And the reason I give these examples is because China today has something called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a massive investment program in many ways similar to the Marshall Plan of 1947. And this Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, what does it do? It lends money, it invests money into creating transportation corridors in the Eurasian continent. The big distinction here is the blue lines, which are sea routes up through the Suez Canal across the Indian Ocean, and the black routes, which are the transportation corridors. The interior of Eurasia, Europe, the European part of Asia, the far eastern part of the European continent going out to the Ural Mountains, and South Asia, Southeast Asia has had historically very little transportation infrastructure for all kinds of historical reasons you can think of, which is its rugged territory. During the Cold War, nobody wanted to invest in these countries. A lot of them were far left leaning. But China wants to change that now on doing, in many ways, on a massive super scale, What the Marshall Plan did, super scale, because it's for two continents, Europe and Asia. And that's what the United States is confronting, okay? Now, if you look at this chart and think of the chart I had up there a moment ago of how what US multinationals just invaded Europe after the Marshall Plan to capture the markets. If you would like to understand what's going on in the world today, these are outlets for massive Chinese manufactured products. It's so that China can manufacture inexpensive toys, medical equipment, fencing, automobile parts, and ship them throughout Eurasia by land or by sea. I would bet $1 that Chinese investment bankers, Chinese advertising companies, and Chinese architects, think of the Athens Hilton Hotel, are going into Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, into Turkey, and into Egypt to design things and advance China's interests. And this is very much not a diplomatic program. It's kind of a bottom-up business program. Okay. There's a friend of mine, Kent Calder, a professor who wrote at Hopkins and wrote a book advancing this thesis, which is that what's going on in the world in the 21st century is the infrastructure, transportation, creation of Eurasia. And it is really an interesting book called Supercontinent. Okay. US multinationals invested in China from late 20th, early 21st century. Most of their strategies, like many of their strategies, backfired because they thought they would be getting free access to the Chinese market. But when the market matured, China started to make life difficult for them, started to, what shall we say, liberate, i.e. steal their intellectual property, pass regulations which limited their behavior. And the game was to get massive multinational investment into China as much as you can, regulate it so it doesn't get too big, and use this as a knowledge base to build up Chinese multinational companies, which is where we are today. Okay. All of this realization that China was playing this game, it dawns on American business and political leaders late, I would say in the mid-2010s, 2015, 2016. And in particular, we have Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google who would go into heat at the thought of going after the Chinese market. But China doesn't view it that way. They want their multinational companies to serve the domestic market. Now, the United States, you will often hear uses an expression called the rule of law. So we have this idea that the international law framework provides a framework for doing business. Well, China doesn't really see it that way because they look at, say, Mr. Roosevelt here with his club and antitrust, view it as Western efforts to keep down China and to run the world from Europe and the United States when this legal structure was created. Okay, so there's many cases where rulings are against China and China just simply ignores it. Okay, I want to emphasize that this competition between US and China, it isn't like a competition waged between brilliant sets of diplomats. It's waged by people who design bullet trains and 5G telecommunication systems at the ground level. That's where the wins and losses are being accumulated, okay? And there's a list of them here, okay? These are all, what are they? They're high tech. If you have better products in a market economy, you'll sell them. No amount of brilliance on the part of Chinese diplomats or American diplomats from the State Department is going to substitute if you have poor products in these areas. Okay. So there are rules of the game. There are rules of the game, but I want to emphasize here that they're established. It's a ground game. It's like blocking and tackling or short passing in football. There's no brilliant plays that are going to override failures on those fronts. All right. Just to quickly go through some of these technologies, there's facial recognition technologies, which has immense consumer product implications for selling things, again, on the ground. If you look at the lower left hand, you'll see an app for, I believe it's the Golden State Warriors. And so if you go to a Golden State Warriors game today and you have downloaded the team app that tells you everything you wanted to know about favorite players, and you walk by the hamburger stand, you might have flash up on your phone a 25% discount for a hamburger, particularly if they're not selling hamburgers well that night. Okay, so this has like extraordinary implications for consumer products. Autonomous vehicles. China is by far the largest manufacturer of automobiles in the world. They make the best electric vehicles. They make the best autonomous vehicles. And if you're GM or you're Tesla, just use common sense here. You don't want to pick a winner. You want to sell cars in the United States and in China. That's where multinational car corporations are at today, and they're kind of short of strategies to help them do that. BMW makes 40% of its profit in China. If China were to shut down BMW in China, the company would be hard pressed to survive. Okay, they're so dependent on the Chinese market. I could go on and on. I don't think we've toted this up. I mean, I just look at the number of educational institutions, so dependent. Private high schools in the United States and colleges were carried for years by Chinese students paying full tuition. It's just one example after another. Semiconductors is another front in this business war. And there are only 6 players in the semiconductor market. China is very, very far behind in the semiconductor industry, putting billions and billions of dollars investing into it to catch up rapidly. And if past experience has any guidance, is likely to be successful. Okay, we could go through artificial intelligence. I will just say here, in the interest of time, that this artificial intelligence could revolutionize all of the other industries were like one industry, but AI could revolutionize all of the industries, including war. It allows you to track and update to destroy mobile targets, whether the mobile targets are ships at sea, submarines, satellites, tanks, whatever. And China is clearly making a big push into those areas. Okay, I'm going to leave a lot of time for questioning. And let me just end on a favorite professor of mine who died a few years ago at Yale was a historian named Robin Winks. And he was known for torturing graduate students. He was actually a nice guy. I don't know what this is a myth made up by graduate students who had to go through this. But when they had to defend their dissertation in the history department, Robin would always say, like, okay, you've just done 600 pages on this, so what? What difference does it make? Okay, so let me try to answer that for this talk. All right. First, intellectuals and academics fundamentally dislike business. It's a built-in bias. So if things come out of the academy or you read about them in journals I won't mention, but I'm not judging here. The point being, you're hearing from people who would like to limit or expose the power of big business. Right. You're unlikely to find recognition in this community that big business has raised 1 billion people out of poverty in China or 5 billion people around the world. Another so what? Running a multinational corporation is getting really hard today. It used to be all about building cross-border value chains. How can you supply Walmart stores in New Jersey with goods manufactured in Vietnam and China, putting them on ships, routing them to the cheapest way through the Suez Canal, through the Panama Canal, so they get to the Rahway, New Jersey Walmart, okay? Now, what people in multinationals have to guess and deal with is massive government intervention into multinationals. You may have noticed that everybody is out to get the tech companies in the United States. Lots of concern about whether they pay enough taxes. We just signed an agreement about, I think, a global agreement for 15% taxes. Let me assure you that means nothing. These companies never pay anything close to 15% taxes. That's why they were willing to support it. Another so what? In politics, you'll see increasingly politicians, I don't know if this is new, but if there's a lot of problems in the country, blame it on China. And guess what? In the United States today, Xi Jinping has a lot of problems today. The private sector is like being eviscerated with its investment. State-owned enterprises are getting much more powerful. But according to Xi's speeches, it's not his fault, it's not China's fault, it's those damn Americans. You know, they're manipulating things around us. All right, US policies, Chinese policies at the national level, ranging from taxes to antitrust, are increasingly being shaped by the reaction to the excesses or perceived excesses of big business. And once again, we see government, as I argued in the beginning of this talk, it's, you know, you could say one step behind. I think it's 2 or 3 steps behind. I mean, to be talking about international antitrust in 2021, this is something that government should have been talking about 10 or 15 years ago. But the broader point is it's once again government being reactive. I don't mean to defend businesses. They are abusing monopoly power, right and left. Look at your cable television bill if you want to see an abuse of monopoly power. They're getting away with murder, okay? Social protest movements are now becoming tools of government and business to put pressure on the various actors to get what they want in Beijing, well, more in Washington and in some other places. There's a case in South Africa, a really unfortunate case where the corrupt government in South Africa had a wing of the African National Congress hire these gangsters from India called the Gupta brothers, and they hired a public relations firm in London to come in and spread horrible stories about to distract attention away from the corruption going on in government. And finally, what I think you see is very vigorous but ineffectual reform movements in these countries to kind of fix what I'm talking about here. I've just got a couple of them listed here. And like, I'll just take corporate governance. Like 15 years ago, corporate governance was held up as the solution to everything. If you can separate the CEO from the president of the company or the chairman of the board, we will have more equitable corporate policies. And these are vigorously sought by serious people. But it seems to me a lot of these have been ineffectual. The trends I'm talking about in this presentation are really powerful megatrends. Okay, let me see if there's any comments or questions. And Lauren, are you going to handle the Q&A?
I am, and we have quite a few questions. And I'll share with everyone that Professor Bracken organized this talk so that we could leave a great deal of time for question and discussion based on our previous experience doing this together. He and I figured out that there are always lots of really insightful questions that spark new directions in the presentation. So if you have questions, would you please place them in the Q&A box. We have about 18 questions queuing right now.
We've got some raised hands too.
Yeah, okay, if we have raised hands. So if you've raised your hand, please go on and just type your question into the Q&A box. And that way we can follow in the order that they're coming in. And if you happen to put a question in the chat window, which is different from the Q&A box, please move your question to the Q&A, because the Q&A keeps them in order, so I can make sure that we get to everybody. So I want to put together a question that Christopher has asked just a few minutes ago, with a question that was asked in the beginning. Actually, Christopher, you've got two questions that kind of dovetail on each other. So you asked, will China's economic model improve the US capitalist model? And also, you're describing, Professor Bracken, the Western way of global power and control. Do you believe that China will use the Western business playbook to become a superpower?
Yeah, good questions. Will China's capitalism improve US capitalism? It might. It seriously might. And this is sort of a happy ending, largely unintended. But you're going to see in many industries sharply increased levels of competition. And we know from economic studies that this increases innovation. It tends to increase budgeting for research and development, which is necessary a lot of times for innovation, okay? So one development that could occur is that productivity increases in the advanced countries, which would be China and the United States. This could have a number of negative consequences, in the sense it could leave people out of this participation of improved economic performance, particularly in the United States. We have seen a lot of that. And I think your second question is also related. Will they follow the Western playbook? I've done a lot of consulting sort of in and around global companies and their strategies and all, with a number of different fields. And it's, I would say the answer is no. It's not that they would reject, say, classic formulations of strategy by Michael Porter, just to use it, of Harvard Business School, or others like them. It's not so much they would reject that. The cultural differences matter a lot, and they see things that the Western mind wouldn't see. Okay, so let me just give an example of this. India would pioneer these outsourcing IT companies like Infosys. Nobody would have thought of that in the United States. Nobody would have thought about the Zaibatsus in Japan, or the Keiretsus, which are these conglomerates of interconnected companies that can shift resources around, and capital investment turns out to be very efficient. In our way of thinking, we just never would have thought of those things. So my answer to this question is that you'll see a tremendous amount of innovation and learning going on. If I were to operationalize this and give advice, I would say to a multinational, you really need to see what the Chinese companies like Alibaba and Tencent and Indian and Japanese companies are doing, because you won't think of it yourself. And if you can learn what they're doing like 6 months earlier than you otherwise would, you'd be in good shape. So I think there's some practical action items here that people still working in business can take advantage of. Next.
Okay, tons of really excellent questions coming in. I want to go along with this idea of the economic structures and where China's going in terms of capitalism and the US model. So Dr. David Ostrander is asking, do you believe that a capitalist economy married to a democratic system of governance would be able to compete with autocratically influenced capitalist economies?
Yeah, so let me just, the question is, can capitalism combine with democracy to compete or outcompete a authoritarian capitalist regime. Let's not pull any punches here. We're talking about the United States versus China. Okay.
But also sort of getting at the
Yeah.
underlying mechanisms
Yeah.
of how those two capitalist agendas are different. I think that's a good point to tease
Okay.
out.
And this is in many ways the $64,000 question. We don't know the answer to this. What we do know is that we've been wrong in the past. We never thought that China could stay as autocratic as it has become, especially in recent years. Because in many ways, China was loosening up in the 90s and in the first decade of the 21st century. But in particular, since Xi Jinping has come into power, he's been in probably about 5 years, and they've really cracked down on a lot of human rights issues, free expression issues, self-expression control issues. People are afraid to talk in China today. People are afraid to talk even in Hong Kong. Okay, so there definitely is an authoritarian push. At the same time that China is becoming a more diverse, pluralistic, educated society. And where I think this leads to is sharply increased levels of political conflict inside China between the Communist Party of China, which represents the authoritarian elements. Okay, we mentioned populism early in the talk. This idea that it's there's a small group at the top, and whatever they claim they're out to sort of screw the average person. Okay, well that comes in spades in China with members of sons and daughters of the Communist Party elite. Okay, who are given opportunities to study abroad, to advance in the government, or to advance in the private sector in China. I just want to make an aside here. I know of a Western automobile company that designs its marketing program for its Audis around this market. And it's sensitive because they know that it alienates a lot of other people. There's really some practical business things here. I don't think we can say which is going to win, the authoritarian or the democratic, or whether there'll be a meeting of the minds, a convergence of the two. So one standard scenario I would give you is for political conflict to sharply increase in China, for people in the party to outmaneuver Xi Jinping and to bring about his downfall, to put a replacement in there who is more sensitive to environmental issues, which are very high on the minds of many Chinese, equitable opportunity in China, and a tolerance for a society in which you're no longer, I mean, in 1985, it was 80% uneducated peasants. That isn't China today. It's not close to being China. Okay, these young people over there are thinking, they're arguing with each other, and you have to have a society which allows that kind of debate, or you're just going to have one string of problems after another. Okay, I mean, they could keep it down for a while, but if there's poor economic performance, as there has been in China, like at least a couple of years ago, these things could really explode.
Okay, a lot of people, you touched on a couple of points that people have raised, particularly the point about the climate change. So I want to get back to that. And there's also a point that people have been putting in very frequently, looking at what the potential for conflict will be. So I'm going to go there in a minute. But before that, I want to go to Robert's question because I think it's a good follow-on to what you've just described. As China becomes more assertive and strategic as a military competitor, there's a potential conflict between U.S. business desires to sell in China and U.S. political objectives to preserve the free world from a spreading Chinese police state. Which desire will dominate?
Boy, this is if you knew what the headaches this is causing in like 10 companies I could mention. So just so we're clear, U.S. big companies desperately want access to the China market. That would be Facebook and Apple and others, but also BMW, also Boeing. Okay, and so what do they do in this current environment? A lot of them don't know what to do. That's what I find in talking to very senior leadership. They don't know what to do, so they shut up. That's not a bad strategy. Okay, so you will not hear many stories about Apple's operations in China, right? But they're trying to position themselves for access to that market over there. The other thing that you have to keep in mind is they're being attacked on the home front by certain senators in the United States as being unpatriotic for dealing with the Chinese. And if any businesses in China, if Apple deals with any companies of any consequence in China, you can be sure that the military in China has access to whatever that is. You should just assume that, okay? Think of the skill set that this puts on that it demands for a multinational leadership program, okay? Which, see, 10 or 15 years ago, it was all about building the supply chain and it's efficient. Engineers know how to do that. It's an extraordinary accomplishment, okay? But I really think they need a different educational program and set of frameworks. There's no answer to this like abandon China. Some companies have. A lot of companies haven't thought about it. GE and IBM had enormous R&D centers in China. Couldn't stand the heat from the criticism from, I don't want to mention any senators in particular, but turn Fox News on any night of the week and they're likely to be on TV criticizing these companies. And they really need to refurbish the training and development programs for their senior leadership corps at these multinationals. So I'm not going to predict who's going to win here or not. I think I like the convergence idea of that China is, because it is a still developing economy with 1.4 billion people, it needs some tougher rules to keep people in line, but not nearly as tough as they have. In the United States, the free expression can easily be carried too far by every group we have, and maybe we've gone too far in the other direction. And I think this presages perhaps the next question you were getting to, Lauren, about military. Wars are fought not by a cold calculation of the military balance, but by the kind of emotional nationalism and populism that exists in countries. That's what drives countries to war, because it drives their leaders to making threats and promises and issuing red lines that they have no possibility of ever being able to implement in the real world. So that's really something to keep in mind. These issues are connected.
So we have a couple of questions that sort of draw on that. James wondered about populism within China and whether or not it's sufficient to sustain Xi Jinping's agenda of propagating Chinese influence across the world. And then we had an anonymous, I don't know who asked this question, but pointing out the Chinese assertion that the #1 goal is to overthrow the US as the #1 global superpower, that China has always sort of seen the US as an enemy. And is there actually a Cold War Part 2 starting, and the US just hasn't realized it yet?
Okay, a couple good areas to dwell on. If you just look at China under Xi Jinping, he has ordered the Communist Party to push the nationalistic propaganda line. So that is absolutely correct. And what does nationalism provide? It provides a kind of emotional feeling for people not doing well in the society that you have their interests. Okay, it's populism has certain universal characteristics which apply in all countries. He's doing this because of the centrifugal effects of globalization and internationalism, that he needs to keep a base of Chineseness, so to speak. And if you were to look at American political science in the past 25 years, one of the things, only until like 2 years ago, nationalism was it was despised, first of all, because it connoted images of like sort of Yahoo patriots waving the flag, getting us into wars. I mean, at Yale, I think there was a course on something like Milosevic and the ethnics of and ethnic cleansing and nationalism, all the worst connotations. And so we didn't study it in the United States. We now wake up to find nationalism is one of the most powerful forces in the world. We never should have forgotten that. Nationalism won World War II. The US got in bed with Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union to destroy Nazi Germany. And it wasn't fought over our accepting the Soviet model for the future, or Stalin, accepting the American liberty for the Soviet Union. It was just raw nationalism. They are attacking your homeland and your country. So there's a big reservoir of this in China. It can get out of control. It has gotten out of control and it has caused wars. But I think there's like 5 or 6 big pieces here, and I'm beginning to think that I understand the relationship. So maybe there's progress here.
All right. So I did promise we would go to this question of war between the US and China. And a number of people have raised this issue. So I'm going to use David's question because I think it's well stated. Will China's rising political and economic power and ambition, along with its substantial investments in modernizing its military, lead to an inevitable conflict with the US, whether that's a Cold War, along the lines of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, or a military conflict? And a number of people have also asked to follow on to that, which is, what's the future for Taiwan? Is China likely to take military action to take over Taiwan? And if so, will that lead to military confrontation with the US?
Okay, well, it's my view that the chances of war are low, but in context, they almost always are low. On 9/11 or 9/10, the chance of war in the Middle East was low. We don't understand the causes of war. Our ability to predict wars is low to non-existent. Having said that, let's look at the US-China. Certainly there's a military competition going there, and the balance of that power has shifted very much in China's favor. Okay, and the US is handling this with sort of classic geopolitics. That's fine. What does that mean? That means we're cooperating with India to create a separate flank on China's interior western front. You can read about the buildup of Chinese and Indian forces there. It's really very interesting. The other feature that has to be mentioned is nuclear weapons. So we could have large wars, World War I, World War II, in which tens of millions of people are killed. But when countries have nuclear weapons, we are an altogether different ballpark. There isn't any goal which would justify the risk of nuclear war for the United States in dealing with China. And I would say the same thing for China dealing with the United States. The nuclear politics are going to be quite interesting. And if you read about recent behavior, China is significantly increasing its nuclear forces, doubling or tripling them, to deter the United States. Not to deter the United States from a nuclear strike on China, which is completely unthinkable, But to make the United States think twice about intervening in a Taiwan contingency or in some of these little islands. And let me put it this way, they're right. If I do a fair amount of work and I'm on some government advisory boards for the Department of Defense. And if truth be told, I would say if I pulled 20 people in the Joint Chiefs of Staff and they could vote anonymously, which they can't, but if they could, and I said, if you were China, what would you do? And they would say, we would triple our nuclear arsenal because it'll spook the United States. It'll make them really be afraid of us. All right. And so that's, in a strange, unfortunate way, it's a calming influence, but it sure is not very good, not good for nuclear non-proliferation. And the other thing I want to mention here about causes of war is the spread of nuclear weapons to Pakistan and North Korea, India, okay, creates explosive scenarios that you can't possibly think of in advance, being triggered by a change of power in Pakistan or in North Korea, or an accident in North Korea. Let me just give one example that I've been working on for one study I've been doing. And North Korea has a legitimate hydrogen bomb now, not an atomic bomb, hydrogen bomb. That's a much bigger bang. The significance of this is if there were an accidental detonation of a North Korean hydrogen bomb in North Korea, the explosion would be so huge at the ground that it would throw up tremendous levels of fallout, which would rain down on Japan and the United States because of the wind patterns, possibly killing thousands of people over the next month or two, and forcing, I think, an American president and a Chinese leader to take action against North Korea. All right. Do I think this accident's going to happen? No. But it's something that I bet nobody in this audience, or hardly anybody, we may have CIA people in the audience here knowing that this is Yale. Okay, they may have thought about this, but I could give you 20 scenarios like that. It is not good that nuclear weapons are spreading, but in an odd way, they have a calming influence.
Okay, let's go to Ellen's question, and I'll say we have 45 questions in the queue. We have about 20 minutes left. So we're not going to get to all of them. I apologize. You are welcome to email us if we didn't get your question and you really would like it answered. We will pass on any questions that come in to Yale Alumni Academy to Professor Bracken so that he can get back to you if he's able to. So let's go to Ellen. If there's war with China, and you kind of touched on this with your hypothetical accidental detonation scenario, but let's talk about a war in which actors are sort of deliberately deploying weapons. What are the chances that we would feel the power of the Chinese military and of China's technological might, much less its allies, right here at home for a change? And if the chance of that is strong, how would that affect nationalism here in the US?
Yeah, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, I think what you're getting into is cyber attacks on the United States and anti-satellite attacks, which would affect all of us in the United States. It would affect everything from weather forecasting to making a withdrawal from your ATM machine. If the satellites went down, you could not draw $50 from your ATM bank. They are wired into the GPS system. Not a lot of people know that. I think both sides, being great powers, major powers with a lot to lose, would try to dampen the escalations so that they wouldn't hit each other with attacks like that. They would proceed very cautiously with staged escalations. What's going on right now in Beijing and in Washington is that the war planners and the respective Pentagons, or whatever the Chinese call theirs, is trying to come up with plans like this that give the national leadership options short of going to a really big war in the correct perception, but most leaders don't want to do that. I have seen, like, I guess I can talk about this, but like before the Iran agreement with the United States, I was privy to some of the thinking of the Pentagon, what we would do if we had to go to war with Iran to prevent them getting a nuclear weapon. And it would scare the daylights out of anybody. A realistic war plan is one where the president doesn't throw you out of the office. Okay. You can't propose solving these problems with huge escalation because you'll never get permission to do that in the United States. I don't think you'll get permission to do that in China. The situation is not good, however, because if you don't think about what these things are and you just provide like nibbling operations, they don't have much of an effect. And then they don't do what the president, whoever president, wants you to happen. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but with the Russian cyber attacks on the United States over the past 5 years, the public newspapers have reported that the US Cyber Command went to the White House and demanded that we get tough with the Russians and that we do to them what they're doing to us. They also, this is quoting only public sources, not from classified information, indicate that we did disrupt several Russian systems and it didn't have any effect. They still attacked us. And now you're in an interesting escalation contest, okay? Well, do we increase the intensity of the attacks on Russia? Or do we increase the intensity of the attacks on China, knowing that they can match us, but we're both now fighting at a higher plane? And most politicians are smart enough to know that if you start unleashing the dogs of war, and this goes to a high level, your ability to control this is going down sharply. I'll just say one final thing here. I'm writing a book on these topics here, and it is striking. We simply don't understand how a lot of these technologies are going to work in real world military scenarios. Mm. We don't know. Right now, for example, what we think is that with a lot of AI, China can target a lot of the US fleet that's in the Western Pacific. All right. But I'll just say they've never practiced it, number one. And two, you can have accidents on the other side, which are positive. That is to say, if China could solve certain problems, they could almost completely neutralize the Seventh Fleet in the Western Pacific. And we would never know that they solved those problems until we saw it in the event of a military operation. Mm. So there's tremendous uncertainties here. The United States has been fighting low-tech Arab militia militant groups for 20 years, consequent to 9/11. They don't shoot back. Or if they shoot back, it's delayed 2 weeks and it's a couple of missiles. All right. This would not be and so we've gotten into the habit of fighting enemies who are not particularly capable, either of hitting the United States or of killing a lot of Americans. And now we're facing an enemy in China. We call, in this scenario, it's fair to call it an enemy. And we really have not, the situation is sort of a mess in terms of the ability of the Pentagon or the Cyber Command to intellectually organize this. I'm sorry to say, I don't think it's necessarily any better in Beijing.
Okay, I want to try to get to two themes that have been coming up pretty frequently before we finish here in our last 10 minutes. One is just getting more onto the topic of AI, and then the other is going more onto the topic of climate change and human rights, human well-being. So I'm going to go to Keith's question. The comparison of Chinese policies on trust busting to policies in the U.S. on trust busting are, he says they're fascinating and want to know if there are examples of U.S. companies stealing IP from other countries or other companies to leapfrog and get ahead. Do you think that Huawei is, I'm sorry if I'm saying it wrong, spying for the Red Guard or others? And there's another question that I want to put with that, but I'm trying to get back to it. So I'll let you go on that one and while I
Sure.
look for the other question.
All right, let me say a couple of things about that. And the idea is if the Chinese can steal technology, does the U.S. companies do this? One thing, the CIA does not do this, and they don't want to do it. And they won't even talk to you if you want to do this. I mean, they make this clear. They don't send people to risk their lives for business secrets. Okay. In my judgment, the overwhelming number of West European and U.S. multinationals would not engage in intellectual property theft because they come out of a culture which is very rules-based and in fact very law-based. So all of the excesses you see in American business today, where you have to sign a 19-page legal agreement, like to talk to the Comcast clerk or something like that, has its downside, but we are a law-abiding society. Chinese, I'm not saying they're not law-abiding. I'm saying they grow out of a very different tradition, much more cutthroat competition, much more sense of resentment that the legal system that we're using to defend our intellectual property was a historical accident of development to create a world which was dominated by the West. And that is not going to last much longer. Now, I got to tell you that having this discussion in my SOM classes on international management with Chinese students in there produced some really interesting give and take between the American students, the Europeans, and the Chinese students. It was like really interesting as each was sort of defending their position. In the 19th century, the US stole intellectual property from European companies wholesale.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on that point because Keith is sort of advising to correct his question and wanted to put it in historical context in the 1920s and 1930s. So I think that's what you're getting to.
Absolutely, and you didn't mention this, but the antitrust thing came up. GE was the biggest violator of antitrust law in the 1930s. Let me just give two interesting facts to bear out what I just said. I don't know how I know these things, but anyway.
That's why we have you on.
It's just, but when the United States decided to build the Erie Canal, and it was a federal project, the Congress had to vote money to build the canal. This is like 1810, 1811. They vote this money, and then somebody says, we don't know how to build it. There's nobody in the US. We don't have any canals. So they added an extra amount to send a team of spies to go to England, which had a lot of canal, and they took with them all kinds of sketch paper and pens and pencils to draw the gears and things like that. Intellectual property theft. GE was in a cartel with Krupp, the German munitions maker, well into 1942. They honored the agreement, the GE Krupp agreement, even when the United States was at war with Nazi Germany. So there is, like, you're absolutely right. You get a lot of ideas from looking back at history.
Okay, there's sort of an angle on the balance between the interests of American corporations and business and the interests of diplomacy. And I want to point out Ellen's question. Can you suggest any US laws that would help us contain our corporations' tendency to give in to the Chinese demands for access to patents and secret information in order to gain access to Chinese markets, while still allowing our corporations to maximize profits for shareholders?
Yeah, I think there's a proposal in Congress right now to do just exactly that, to make it illegal for the United States companies in China to give away intellectual property secrets. Now, and there has been examples and prosecutions of this, but the ones I'm familiar with are in the defense sector. And it was, I can't think of the name, but it had to do with clearly a defense system that we gave intellectual property away to a Chinese company, and in order to get a contract in China. It's rare and esoteric, the ones that I have examples of. It may be that after the next outrage of Chinese intellectual property theft or internet, stealing stuff over the internet, that you'll just produce a stampede in Congress in this, whether the law is good or bad or makes any sense whatsoever. As you look at congressional history, they have been known to have a herd effect where they sign bills that they don't know what they're doing. Wouldn't be the first time. I will say this though, the idea that China is sucking the intellectual property out of the United States is misleading, because they are making huge improvements themselves. The level of Chinese technologies today is about what the United States is. Some are ahead in some areas, some are not in other areas. But they did this, the intellectual property theft, to accelerate the time it took to reach major power status. They wanted to cut this time to as short as possible, probably because they were facing this demographic volcano beneath the society that they needed to feed, clothe, house, and get jobs for these people. But it's their R&D in AI, in electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, is better than the United States today. They do it in ways that we wouldn't tolerate. There was just a Tesla that killed somebody in California, an autonomous vehicle. And this may cause a pause in the testing of Teslas in the United States. If you killed a pedestrian in China with an autonomous vehicle, I can assure you that they would not stop R&D and operations with autonomous vehicles around China. Now, there's climate change, I think, came up too. China is a big coal user, and we've heard all the stories about why we pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. But the world is moving to electric vehicles. It seems to me there's just no doubt about it. And China is in the lead on that front. So China is under the official Chinese policy is very pro-environment, number one, except in energy production and coal. And their view is they don't really have an alternative. And the other thing is there's really a lot of popular opinion, which does matter, that the Chinese government could never sort of turn to a cavalier attitude toward climate change issues. It would just alienate so much of their middle and upper middle class, which is getting more and more political clout, and doesn't want to live in dirty, polluted cities. And if anybody in this group has been to China, well, you'll know what it's like on a bad day in Beijing. So.
Okay, time for one more question. Yeah, we have 33 outstanding questions. So time for a whole nother hour of discussion, but I think maybe we can pick one more. I want to stay on the AI topic. And so many of your questions, thank you. They've all been really fascinating, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of them. Bob asks, AI, especially machine learning, advances when there is a large amount of data that can be used to train neural nets. Do you think that because of the lack of privacy in China, they have an advantage in making advances in AI? How does the recently passed legislation from Congress potentially level the playing field by funding US research on AI and quantum computing?
Okay, again, AI is very important. I think one of the biggest competitive advantages China has is because there's no privacy of information, the government can get it all. They do, and this provides them massive data sets. It's also why Apple wants to get into China, why Uber wanted to get in China until they got their heads bashed in by Diddy a few years ago. And so there's absolutely no doubt that this is a big source of competitive advantage. Read today's recent news about this company, Diddy. It's really interesting because the Chinese government is cracking down on them because they don't think Diddy is going to give the government all the information they have. So if you were to look, I think there's a parallel. You go back to the 1970s and 80s, Japanese companies are very successful, and they really want to invest in the United States to build Toyota factories in Alabama and places like that. One of the reasons they want to get close to the market, obviously basic management 101, but they also want to get out from under the heel of the Japanese government, the Ministry of Finance in Tokyo, MITI, the Ministry of Trade and Investment, because in Japan, they're getting all this regulatory overlay on them. So where I'm going to go with this is simply that if the Chinese government thinks they can keep cracking down on Ant Financial, on Diddy, on Alibaba, the historical pattern is more likely to be that business is going to swallow government. Today, it may be the Communist Party in charge, but what's coming is some version of what you see on K Street, where the business people in charge of these giant corporations, they're the ones with a lot more power in Beijing. And some people, I suspect even in this audience, would say that's what's happened with K Street replacing Constitution Avenue. So we're in for like a really interesting time when we look at business as an institution, and the inadequacy, if you will, of some classic approaches to geopolitics is if the military confrontation was the be all and end all. The ground war here is going to be won in the industrial sectors, pharmaceuticals, AI in a way, aerospace, things like that. And that's radically different from the Cold War. Soviet Union didn't have any private sector. Thank heavens it helped us beat them. So it's going to be a fascinating subject for many Yale lectures of the future.
All right, well, that means we will have to have you back to talk more about this and maybe get to the other 40 questions. Thank you all for all of your enlightened comments and input, for your attention, for participating with Yale Alumni Academy. We look forward to seeing you on the next activity that we host. Today's presentation was part of our Festival of Ideas and Enrichment, which is running from July 7th through the 21st. We have 6 programs. Please visit our website, yalealumniacademy.com, for more information and to register for the next sessions. And thank you, Professor Bracken, for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Lauren.
Okay, have a great day.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.